Part 2 is titled The System Still Works, and that is kind of the optimistic view that one could very realistically hold in the period in the late 1840s or say 1850, if one picked that as an artificial stopping point for a class. So, we're starting with nativism. And that term was coined in 1845. As with a lot of the efforts to understand when a term originated, it's likely the term was used in verbal expression before we can find it left for us somewhere in print. That said, the first evidence we have of the use of the term nativism came in the Whig Almanac in 1845. In this issue, the editor of the Whig Almanac was reflecting on the recent election, which you remember, because you follow 1840s politics, is the one that Polk won. And if you look from this page of the Whig Almanac over here, which I have blown up a portion of over here, see this little paragraph? That's what's over here. And you can see that they know it. Polk owes his election to the Liberty Party. If there was no Liberty Party, which drew almost all of its votes from people who used to be Whigs, then Clay would have won New York. What I didn't mention to you, Clay would have also won Michigan by a closer margin. So they know, right? And they're all worked up about this. But the editor, in the process of reflecting on how Polk won the election, which he feels like Clay should have won, he also diverged into this issue of Native Americanism. Now, that term was in use before 1845. Native Americans, that's what white people who were born in the United States often called themselves. And they would often capitalize it, Native American. To a 21st century ear, this can be confused with the indigenous inhabitants of this land. That didn't confuse anybody in 1845. They didn't call those people Native Americans. They called them Indians, or often savages, and other such terms of the time. So, Native Americans. It was a term that white people used to say, I was born here, it's my country. So, in the flow of this part of the editor's discussion, he says thousands of adopted citizens, heretofore Whigs, were impelled to go over to the opposite party, the Democrats. Thousands were naturalized expressly to oppose nativism, and voted the Polk tickets mainly to that end. The particulars here aren't as important as now there was a single term to express the idea that people were opposed to immigrants. Nativism. The sentiment was there before the term, obviously. It's sort of like manifest destiny, right? The ideas were there, and then someone developed a term that nicely encapsulated the already present ideas. Nativism. Nativism was, in many ways, behind much of the violence that we saw in the mobocracy of the time. The attacks on Catholics, the attacks on the convent, the Bible riots. Nativist groups often claimed to be operating in the memory of George Washington, who, remember, in his farewell address had warned that the country should beware of foreign influence. So, like everyone else, casting themselves as the heirs of George Washington's great influence, the nativists formed social groups and political groups. The first one that really got swift political traction was the American Republican Party, which was formed in New York and Philadelphia in 1843. If you remember the timing of the Bible riots, it's right here, 1844, right as these political movements were sweeping to local political power in New York City and in Philadelphia. Thrilled with their success in New York City and Philadelphia, it now developed into a national, a party that aspired to be national, the Native American Party, created in 1844. This is the party that some of you may know from later, when it became known as the Know Nothing, or just the American Party. But initially, the Native American Party. And the Native American Party and nativists in general, they had multiple motivations for their hostility to immigrants. But one that lay at the heart of it at this period was anti-Catholicism. It was because so many of the immigrants of this period were Catholics from Ireland. So anti-Catholicism. And this was deeply connected to the ideas about American democracy. As we've mentioned before, the idea was that Catholics couldn't really operate in a democratic society because they only did what the Pope told them, only thought what the Pope told them, and would, in a society that allowed voting, vote as the Pope told them. This would allow for an eventual papal takeover of the U.S. government. Is this kind of talk? Okay, so anti-Catholicism was at the beating heart of the nativist movement. But there were certainly other factors. Because the Irish were the most hated, but not the only. There was a general, widespread sense that, and you can see this in the flyer over here, that the American working man was hurt by immigration. That immigrants drove down wages and took jobs that would otherwise belong to Native Americans. So there's an economic argument, there's a religious argument, there's a political argument, and there was also a cultural argument. That English is the American language, Protestantism is the American religion, and anything that weakens or disrupts that is fundamentally, un-American. You'll notice that those things aren't written down or defined anywhere. It's just a thing that people like this believe. So nativists formed newspapers in the American democratic tradition of free speech and freedom of the press, devoted to opposing Roman Catholics, foreigners holding office, the establishment of nunneries and the Jesuits, and on and on. We are burdened with enormous taxes by foreigners, corrupted in the morals of our youth, interfered with in our government, forced into collisions with other nations, tampered with in our religion, injured in our labor, assailed in our freedom of speech. Which is a pretty good summary of the nativist arguments. This diversion into nativism, in the midst of our focus on Texas and westward expansion, is largely because, well, I'm trying to go chronologically. And what often happens is that people address all this in the 1850s. We don't have the 1850s. So here it is, developing in this period in the 1840s. But let's shift our attention back out to Texas, where, remember, Texas had joined the United States without any firm settlement of what exactly Texas's western border was. You remember that Mexico insisted that all of this still belonged to Mexico, that Texas went to the Nueces and the Red River up here, and then this straight line. Texas insisted that Texas went all the way to the Rio Grande River, or as the Texans were starting to call it, the Rio Grande. So, Mexico was hesitant to fight a full war against the United States. They therefore left Mexican forces on the western side of the Rio Grande, or as they called it, the Rio Grande. So the Mexican forces did not come into the territory that they believed firmly belonged to Mexico, but stayed in the territory that everyone agreed was Mexico. Polk, in contrast, sent what he called the Army of Observation straight through the agreed-upon Texas, into the disputed portion of Texas, and right to the banks of the Rio Grande. Polk was trying to pick a fight, hoping that Mexico would defend what they insisted was their territory, because the Americans are in it. This 4,000-man force was led by General Zachary Taylor. For several weeks, nothing happened. And then, something happened. Something happened that is about as accurate as I feel I can be for you. Something happened along the Rio Grande. Shots were exchanged. Blood was spilled. All of those sentences, I feel, are accurate. What is not clear is where this shooting took place. Mexico insisted that it happened on the western side of the Rio Grande, which means, of course, that the Americans had invaded. Polk insisted that Mexico, here's Polk's announcement. He says, "The cup of forbearance has been exhausted. After reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced, and the two nations are now at war." You may remember that the Constitution says that Congress declares war. But Polk was skillfully backing Congress into a corner. by maintaining, through telegraphed information from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, that Mexico had invaded the United States. War exists, he says, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it. So the question now was, would Congress back this, or would they challenge a president very clearly trying to instigate a war?